and gentlemen, we are indeed fortunate this afternoon to have a speaker who is a renowned classical philosophy scholar. As you can see to my right, to my left, you see the shadows of three figures there. They stand for three classical philosophers, namely Plato, Aristotle, and Saint Albert the Great. So we have one great classical philosopher in our midst today. He attained his masterate and doctorate degrees from the Catholic University of Lublin, Poland, and finished postdoctorate studies at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies at Toronto, Canada. He is professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy of Culture at John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, and also the president of the Lublin School of Christian Philosophy. He has lectured at universities in Europe, North America, and Africa. Has been a visiting professor at many universities. At present, a visiting tutor of the Council of Universities of Western Civilizations in the US. He is a regular participant at international conferences and scholarly meetings. He belongs to several philosophical societies, including the International Society of Thomas Aquinas. He is editor-in-chief of the philosophical journal by the name Man and Culture, founded in 1992. He's a member of the scientific committee of the Universal Encyclopedia of Philosophy in 10 volumes, published by the Polish Society of Thomas Aquinas, Lublin. He authored many articles in philosophy and has published several books in English, namely Metaphysics and Art in 2002, Ethics, the Drama of the Moral Life with Matthew Anderson in 2003, Science in Culture in 2007, Polish Culture of the Word, the Fundamentals of Classical Rhetoric with Jaroszynski in 2008, Beauty and Being, Thomistic Perspectives in 2011, and a forthcoming book entitled Metaphysics or Ontology. Finally, I'd like to tell you that the philosopher we're about to encounter today was a student when the great philosopher, Blessed Pope John Paul II, was an ethics professor in Lublin. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak about Aquinas' metaphysics versus mythology, ontology, and ideology, it is my honor and pleasure to present to you Professor Dr. Piotr Jaroszynski.
Good afternoon, everybody. Being for the first time in your country, I am especially impressed not only by the warmth of your hearts, but also by what is very rare in our world, intellectual energy. So precious, and what is very important, that these two energies are shared by young generations, by students and graduated who accompany us and help in the Congress, so important. So thank you very much, and of course, to Father Alfredo Koch for inviting me. My topic, Aquinas, metaphysics versus mythology, ontology, ideology, someone can ask why I put together those three different words, mythology, ontology, ideology. There is a key. And first of all, is that these three areas of human culture try to substitute metaphysics. The other point is that when we want to talk about dialogue between different cultures and civilizations, we need metaphysics. And we need to, as the first step, we need to, and I will try to do it. I know that some people will be angry at me, but what I will try to do is to close the concepts, I will close them. Because I do not appreciate attitude when someone, if you don't have a word, call it philosophy. No, never. It is too precious. So first, let us try to close the concepts, and then, when we close them, they will help us to open the door for a dialogue. It is more difficult, but it is, I think, more fruitful. So, mythology. Mythology as proto-metaphysics, or the area of culture which is deeper than metaphysics. We encounter this problem in Aristotle, when in the first book of Metaphysics he was discussing different answers to the most classical and the most metaphysical question, diati, why? Why? And he took into account answers given by, he called them the ologoi. And his comments were like this, but into the subtleties of the mythologists, it is not worth our while to inquire seriously. Those, however, who use the language of proofs, we must cross-examine and ask why. You see, the point was that in the case of mythology, we do not encounter proofs. Mythologists, they do not explain and do not give reasons for their answers. So it is not a question whether the answers are true or false, but we need to have some procedure to check whether these answers are true or erroneous. Another problem is that if you take a mythological text, the text is full of metaphors. And what happens to metaphor is that metaphor is always ambiguous. And then we have a question, what are the criteria of interpretation? What are the criteria of choice to prefer one interpretation than another? And there is a question of authority. Who and why is supposed to be responsible for interpretation that we can trust him? So there are questions like this. And when we come back to Aristotle, we see that for him the concern was to find such a kind of cognition that can be justified and can be shared with other people, because you give them the tools to get such a cognition. So it is not that we have some mysteries. No. I give you a tool. I tell you what is truth. And check. You can do it yourself. So in that case, we are moving in the area which was called in Greek culture science. It was Greek episteme. Science is misleading because in 1830, in the English-speaking world, the new meaning of science was imposed. That's why we are still misled when we are talking about philosophy as science, because science is limited to so-called mathematical-physical sciences. But it is not true. Science as episteme is especially philosophy and metaphysics. So it is the Greeks who discovered cognition called episteme, science. And the first science was philosophy. And the most precious was first philosophy, which was later called metaphysics. So you see, there are so many problems related to mythology, to how to include mythology into the area of episteme science, that Aristotle preferred to go his own way, the way of science. When we ask the question diati, looking for the reasons, causes of the stated fact. There is a fact of change. Why there is a change? And he was looking for answers. You see, so that's why this way of mythology, so dominant and popular in all civilizations, older than Greek culture, was rejected. And the path to new area of culture was opened, the area of science. And this is why mythology cannot be accepted as equivalent for metaphysics. In the case of the Catholic Church, we need to understand the difference between Theologia Sacra, where the point of departure is revelation, as we find in the Bible, and mythology. It is revelation, and mostly dominated by the language of metaphor. So we have so-called nothing revelabile, what is revealed, but then is judicium de acceptis. Then we have to understand what contains what is revealed. And the procedure is very complicated. We have tradition, we have fathers and doctors of the church, we have the Pope, and we need, what was especially stressed by John Paul II, who discussed these problems in his Fides et Ratio, we need realistic philosophy, you see? Because if revelation was directed to ordinary men, the metaphor as comparison must have had its analogy in reality. So we need philosophy to explain reality, and on the basis of this explanation, we can try to understand deeper what contains what is revealed. That's why, even when Pope, although he mentioned around 28 times the name of Thomas Aquinas, and didn't say that exactly it is the only philosophy we should use in theology, but anyway, you can invent new philosophy, but there is one condition: it must be realistic. It must explain reality. And this is the point. And I'm really happy that just 1 year before encyclical was published, my professor, Father Krompiec, who taught me metaphysics and who invited Karol Wojtyła in 50s to work at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Lublin, Catholic University of Lublin, that year before it was published, we were invited to Castel Gandolfo for dinner. We spent 3 hours talking about relation between philosophy and theology, and we didn't know that he is going to publish encyclical about it. So you see, it is how these ideas are circulating. And this is the tradition of the school, when someone has professors who introduce him to the tradition of many, many generations. And then it is easier not to be lost, especially in philosophy. Because if philosophy does not help you to understand reality, it can make you crazy. You have 1,000 different views, and what to do? What to do? Immediately it's relativism, subjectivism, and finally you just change your profession. So it was a discovery. Imagine the discovery of metaphysics which happened to Parmenides. It was revelation in philosophical revelation, discovery of being. And he was really shocked. And it is not a question what were the consequences in his own view, but the discovery of being as being. And it was the way which was undertaken by Plato and Aristotle. And this is metaphysics. But now we come to the second point. If we reject mythology, then we have to go to ontology. Why not ontology? I encountered many times in different publications that metaphysics is just treated like ontology. So these terms are used interchangeably, metaphysics or ontology. Or the second approach is when ontology seems to be more important than metaphysics. Or even that we should exclude metaphysics and leave ontology. In my opinion, when I was trying to analyze the problem in many different articles and books, it is the crucial point to understand the difference between metaphysics and ontology. There were at least two most important controversies, philosophical controversies. One between Aristotle and Plato, and second between Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. And to understand philosophy, its dramaturgy, we need to understand these two controversies. What was the most important problem? The most important controversy between Aristotle and Plato. It was the problem whether we can know scientifically reality. This reality around us, material reality. And Plato said no. Aristotle said yes. So what were the consequences? We can observe in the history of philosophy, the path of Plato was undertaken by Neoplatonists. And they didn't care about reality around them. They were searching for being in ecstasies, which enabled them to reach the one. But what for philosophy? Jan Lichus, Neoplatonist, said, we need theurgics, we need magic. It is better, it's accessible to everyone. We do not need philosophy. So Neoplatonism, in one sense, was the end of philosophy. And even if the end was not because of the replacing philosophy with theurgics or magics, what happened was rejection of reality as valuable, as something we can understand scientifically. And Aristotle saved reality for scientific cognition with all its consequences. Because we can talk about values, but is value real? It is the most important question. Look, we are talking about values. Is it real? Take into account Kant. For Kant, value is not real. There is opposition between being and Sollen, Sein and Sollen. So thank you for such a value. We need true values. What it means, we need values which are real. And this is a problem which solution of the problem depends upon philosophy, the kind of philosophy we want to approach it. So it was this first controversy. And the second was more subtle. And many, because this controversy between realism and idealism is well known for the students of philosophy. But the second controversy is more complicated, more subtle. You know what is the problem? If you remember the beginning of the book Gamma, Estin epistemetis heteoreito on kai tatuto heparton takat auto. There is a science on being qua being. So you see, what is the object of this science? It is being qua being. And someone can say, okay, it is metaphysics, a term very complicated, not invented by Aristotle, the term which did not belong to Greek language. It was probably invented in the 1st century before Christ. Why not to use ontology? Because you have toon, Greek being, and logic, logos, it is science. Why? It's better. But the problem is more complicated. Because you see, as the term metaphysics was invented in the 1st century before Christ, the term ontology was coined much more later. It was the beginning of the 17th century. It was 1606. And the meaning of ontology, if we take into account the object of ontology, as it was declared by these people who started to replace metaphysics with ontology, was different. But the difference had its history, and they were not aware of this history, because the term ontology was invented by so-called Deutsche Schulmetaphysik, German school metaphysics, exactly speaking Protestant metaphysics. And you all know what happened? As you remember, Luther himself was against philosophy, against metaphysics, against Aristotle, against Thomas, and the language he used, all these metaphors were really terrible. But when there was a war between the Catholics and Protestants, the war was also at the level of ideas. And Protestants realized that they have to learn metaphysics to fight Catholics. But what happened was that they were looking for a book they can find a lot of different information about the history and the most important positions in the history of metaphysics. And you know whom they found? Francisco Suarez, his Disputaciones Metaphysicae. Francisco Suarez, Spanish Jesuit. And he wrote his Disputaciones Metaphysicae at the University of Salamanca. The building where he wrote this disputation, now it is the secondary school, but it still exists. So what was the point? One can say, okay, so such a Catholic writer as Francisco Suarez, what happened that Protestants just made this kind of choice? It was the first time, except maybe Averroes, that it was not commentary to Aristotle's Metaphysics, but it was according to the most important points. So we have first the end, so how we should understand being, what were different conceptions of being, there are transcendentals, and so on and so on. So it was not as commentary, but according to Ordo level. So what happened with Suarez? What's wrong with Suarez? You see, there was a controversy between Thomas Aquinas could know Duns Scotus, but Duns Scotus, who lived a little bit later, did not agree with Thomas Aquinas in one crucial point related to the object of metaphysics. Look how it is subtle, but the consequences are enormous, because today the philosophy we live in, it is what was done by Suarez and Deutsche Schulmetaphysik. What was the difference? The difference of one word. St. Thomas says the object of metaphysics is being. Duns Scotus says the object of metaphysics is the concept of being. You see? One can ask, big difference, crucial difference. Crucial difference. You know why? Because the concept is the effect of abstraction. Concept is the effect of abstraction. If we make a concept of man or a tiger, there are some properties or elements of this being we take into account, and others we put aside. So when we apply abstraction to being, to catch being, we have a concept of being which is finally very, very poor. And Duns Scotus said, in the concept of being we have only non-contradiction. And when Hegel says that in being, concept of being, there is contradiction. You see, it is the consequence of applying abstraction to catching being. So what we put aside, it is not being, you see, we put aside everything except non-contradiction or even contradiction and non-contradiction. It is incredibly important to understand this moment in the history of philosophy. But the most important here is not only that we put aside the content and so specific, let's say, elements. So, for example, if you want to abstract the concept of a tiger, we put aside what is the weight of the tiger, because there are tigers which are not equal, you see. But we have to remind, and now we see why it is so important. We take into account the approach of St. Thomas Aquinas to being. What is the constituent of being? It's existence. Without existence, there is no being. Existence is the act of the essence. And we cannot grasp existence with abstraction. We need existential judgments. We need judgments, existential judgments. So if we take abstraction, it leads us to non-contradiction or even contradiction as in Hegel. But if we take the way of so-called, there is a specific way of grasping existence. and the being as existent, it is the way of separation. And what happened is that if we put aside existence, what is the ontic status of the content? It is a possible being. You see, it is a possible being because it does not exist. It is possible being. And this is how ontology started to treat the object of ontology as a possible being, as a possible essence. And it is Suarez who knew both solutions, and he preferred solution of the Scotus. And what happened to so-called Thomism, that Thomism after the death of Thomas, and especially after Suarez, started to be Scotistic. And this is a paradox, you see. So when I hear Thomism, not here, but we have to be very sensitive. It is Maritain and Jaroszynski who discovered the difference between Thomas Aquinas and originality of his invention, understanding of being, the difference between Thomas Aquinas and so-called different Thomisms. Because Thomisms were penetrated by Scotism. And this is what was called scholasticism. Scholasticism, which was the background of education of all modern philosophers. Because they attended to Jesuit schools or Protestant schools. Everywhere was Suarez. You see, and it was scholasticism, but because it was at the level of secondary school, or let's say more precisely, it was Lyceum, Gymnasium or Lyceum, 8 years. So when I analyzed the education of René Descartes, it was 8 years Gymnasium, 3 years of philosophy. So it was logics, philosophy of nature, and 1 year of metaphysics, Suarezian metaphysics. You see, when I analyzed the education of Francis Bacon, he studied at Oxford when he was from 12 to 14. And he studied 2 years, no, 1 year, because 1 year he was sick. And then there was a legend, mythos, about how these guys overcame scholasticism, medieval philosophy, and they started philosophy anew. Sure, if someone is not sufficiently uneducated, it is the best way to be original. But we must be precise, you see. So, in that case, when we talk about ontology, we must be aware that, precisely speaking, the object of ontology is the possible being. But the point is that if it is a possible being, there is no way back. You cannot deduce the real being from possible being. That's why you have so artificial questions. Why there is something rather than nothing, put by Leibniz. It is the case. Because when you confront the classical metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas, you start with the statement of fact. This being here exists. And I want to understand why this being exists, even though there is no sufficient reason in this being to exist, because existence is not the essence of this being. So the question is put very precisely and very concretely. In the case of the Leibnizian question, it's an abstract question. You see the difference? And then all these ontologies involve God to find a solution. Why there are real beings, but they were unable on the basis of ontology to reach the real being. So finally, one of them engaged God, and they were so tricky that they knew what, the inner life of God. Thank you. And on the other hand, they rejected God, independent, it must be ontology, without any reference to reality and without any reference to God. And this is, what are the consequences? They say metaphysics is over because they don't see the difference. Over. Metaphysics was overcome or has to be overcome. And we need to move to myths and to poetry. But as in the case of Kant, we must ask a very concrete question. He overcame metaphysics. Which metaphysics? Which metaphysics he knew? He knew Alexander Baumgarten metaphysics, who was a pupil of Christian Wolff, and Wolff was a pupil of Leibniz. And the conception of being you find in Wolff and Baumgarten, it is being as a possible being. It is what Kant overcame, that's all. Kant didn't have an idea about Duns's Scotus, about Thomas Aquinas, nothing. So these kinds of generalizations in the area of philosophy are very dangerous because we must identify what is what. And we have tools. It is not that I am a prophet. No, you can check. Take, for example, Wolff, Christian Wolff, Ontologia sive prima philosophia. And you can check that there is only one time he mentions the name of Duns Scotus, but in the index only, even not inside. You see how it works? So that's why we have to be very, very sensitive to these problems because ideas have consequences. And the last point, ideology. Ideology, again, it was a neologism invented at the end of 18th century by Destutt Fassi, who was very active as an intellectual in the French Revolution. He was even the Minister of Education. And he invented the name, and also he constructed the science called ideology. It was first philosophy. It was the science on sense perception. Because for him, he was a student of Condillac. A Condillac is a tradition of post-Cartesian sensualists. Ideas were just impressions, sense was impressions. So he wanted to substitute, replace ideology in place of metaphysics as a first philosophy. But what happened next? It was a practical program. The first philosophy started to be practical program to change man and society. So ideology was united to utopies. And this is how ideology started to be an important part of different kinds of totalitarianism. Because all these totalitarian ideologies, they want to change the man, the society, the earth, and the universe according to their a prioristic ideas. And in that case, they do not respect the reality and that they do not respect the nature, because they say there is no nature, there is no essence, there is no existence, it is the pure matter, and we can reform it from the beginning, but to change it, we have to destroy what already exists. That's why they do not care from any point of view, from the viewpoint of philosophy, from the viewpoint of morality or religion. They start their program. So destroy family, destroy nation, destroy independence, and then build a new man, a new society. And they don't care for the victims. The communism killed at least 100 million people. At least. Nazi around 20 million, but they didn't live so long. At least 100 million. Why? They wanted to construct new man and new society. And victims, the number of victims doesn't matter. Because we are not persons. We are just matter to be reconstructed in a different way, especially when using technology. So in that case, we have to appreciate what the Greeks discovered and what we do not encounter. If we encounter someone knows about it, I really appreciate it. It is so-called theoria. Now, we contrast theory and practice. Or we say it is only theory. Look, Greek word theoria means that I look at reality trying to understand it. Why? First of all, as Aristotle explains in his Protrepticus, the act of the intellect is the highest act of human act. That's why all other acts should be subordinated. So should be subordinate to our intellectual life. The second point is that what is the aim of the act, of the highest act of the intellect? Intellect can work for different purposes, but the most precious is the truth. So we need to be, we are human beings fully when we are able to know the truth for the sake of the truth, not for the sake of any other good. Because if we look for cognition is subordinated to other aims, it means that we reduce what we want to understand to these aspects, which are important for some action, practical action, but from the viewpoint of being, are accidental. So first, we have to know the truth about what is real in the most essential aspects. And the most essential aspects, the first, is whether it is really a being. Whether it is a being when it exists. Very simple answer, but look, only few philosophers took account of it. So, if we understand that the most important, it is not that we want to reduce our life, human life, to intellectual life, only contemplating reality. No, there are all other actions. Also, when we're hungry, we have to eat, we have to drink, sure. But look, we are taught by metaphysics that first it is important to check whether it is a real food and not a plastic food, you see? Whether this water is not polluted. Because if it is polluted, it's not water anymore for drinking. So simple and so wise. And that's why metaphysics can be called wisdom. But not wisdom which is immersed in metaphors. No, it touches reality. And when we are able to appreciate the meaning of metaphysics as a realistic philosophy, then we are open to discuss with all the people from any culture. Sure, we can discuss. Why not? It is metaphysics does not tell you what is exactly the truth in that case. You have to check it. But tells you what is the truth, the meaning of the truth, that it is adequation between our cognition and reality. And check it, whether there is this adequatio. You see, metaphysics gives you the meaning of the definition of the truth. You have to take into account reality and your cognition. Without metaphysics, there is no truth in the sense of the understanding what truth means. That's why when you take into account, be sincere, let's say, who, before studying here at St. Thomas University, San Tommaso, learn at any school what exactly this word truth means? No one. So we are educated for subjectivism, relativism, and idealism. So it is not that we impose what other people have to think. but we impose that they do understand what the truth means. And then we can analyze what they say, and they can analyze themselves. There is no hidden, mysterious knowledge. It's open, you see, it's democratic. But it needs an effort. And this is what people mostly do not like. Intellectual effort is a hard effort, but brings the fruits. So I think that if we seriously want to be open for any dialogue, we need metaphysics, but precisely understood in that way I tried to explain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Jaroszynski. As chair and moderator of this session, I'd like to say a few words before we get on with the open forum. By this time, I presume we already know the procedures for the open forum. But I suggest that we add another one, and this, or at least for this plenary session, for the greater democratization of our procedures. I suggest that local participants and foreign participants take turns in asking questions. If there are no objections, I will now open the forum. Yes, Doctor.
I'm Paolo Bulaños from the University of Santa Tomas.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Jaroszynski, for your paper. Now, my question is more of a clarificatory question, and I'm going to ask this question because you strike me as someone who values clarity. So I hope that you could clarify the issue. Now, if philosophy is a science, or if metaphysics is a science, as you claimed in your lecture, I'm just wondering what is the basis, or what is a normative ground of this kind of science? And by normative ground, what I mean by that is what makes metaphysics or metaphysical presuppositions acceptable in the first place. Now, is it based on empirical analysis? Is it based on pure theoretical formulations? And if it's the latter, what do you think is the role of language as constitutive of thinking itself? Now, given your premise also that philosophy/metaphysics is our way of explaining or interpreting reality.
According to me, that metaphysics is a science, but it was a long tradition, longer than tradition of excluding metaphysics or philosophy from science, because actually it started in the Renaissance, but the most important was the 19th century and positivism and so on. What makes cognition scientific? First of all, we need to ask the question. What answer we are looking for? The second is we need to have an object of our cognition, and the third element is we need a method adequate to the aim and to the object. So in the case of metaphysics, you can give them all. But these people will not listen to you, because what happened is that they started to, and it was the influence of nominalism, they started to eliminate all the causes. They eliminated the final cause, they eliminated the efficient cause, then the formal cause, and matter was left, but understood in a quantitative way. And then, on the basis of matter understood as quantity, they reconstructed the conception of science. And when they applied this new conception of science to metaphysics, the answer was metaphysics is not a science, you see? And here is the problem. Here is the problem. Because when you talk about experience, experiments, or sense cognition, it is after Cartesian revolution when there was a tendency to reduce human cognition only to sensuous cognition. And that's why ideology appeared, and that's why you have positivism. But the point was, what they say, what are criteria to call what they say, what is science, scientific? They do it according to the criteria, it's impossible. So at the level of meta-science, what they say is not scientific. You see? That's why we shouldn't be, let's say, we shouldn't have this complex of minority. Because we have to reconstruct how, what was the process to eliminate metaphysics from the area of science, where in the case of quantity, you ask another question. You ask how. And if it is the model of scientific cognition is mathematics, you have to give the rules. And that's all. So all elements are different. And to dispute with them, we have to look what were the reasons, for example, to eliminate the final cause. And it is, for example, Roger Bacon. You take his text, not Morgan, and you read. He completely did not understand what was the final cause in Aristotle, because he didn't read Aristotle. The same Hume, he criticized the concept of substance, but he didn't know Greek, you know. And he didn't read in Greek Aristotle. And all these geniuses, you know, were uneducated, and this is a problem. And no, maybe it is too strong, but what I used to do, I check the text, I take in original, I check Hume in English, I check his education, and it's incredible. You know who created these geniuses? Those who started to write histories of philosophy. And they were really disappointed in relation to Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, you know, this scholasticism. No, now we have new philosophers. And this is how it works.
Professor Ivan Kalchev, Sofia University, St. Clement Ohridski, Bulgaria. Professor Jaroszynski, I think that is not necessary to thank you for a very good paper. I agree with your position about mythology and ideology and connection with metaphysics of Santo Thomas. But I will not categorically agree with position about ontology. I think that to destroy ontology, to eliminate ontology from the contents of philosophy, now is not possible. After the creation of two kinds of modern contemporary ontology, like fundamental ontology of Heidegger and phenomenological ontology of Sartre. Because in these ontologies, the problem, anthropological problem of man, is very good integrated with classical, typical, traditional ontological problem. So, my question is firstly, why you need to eliminate ontology? If ontology, I think that ontology is a heart of philosophy. And when ontology is combined in good sense means of the word, it is very good. In second aspect of my question, you thought that metaphysics is science. It's true, I agree. But correctly, what means science? I think that situation of science is when I, as a philosopher, for example, for metaphysics, question, but I don't know answer. I try to find answer of question who I put. Every religious metaphysics, like metaphysics of St. Thomas, is small in other situation. Because if I am Christian philosopher and I put question, I know the answer.
Okay.
Because as a Christian philosopher or other religious philosopher, I know that last answer gives me God.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for 3 questions. Now, I'm not going to talk too long, very shortly. First of all, I don't want to destroy ontology. I want to destroy the myth of ontology. Because it is not, what I stress is not to identify ontology with metaphysics or to put ontology as a first philosophy. Because what happens next, you cannot deduce reality from ontology, which is related only to possible beings. But ontology, as you know, what they do, they construct new models of the world. Very interesting. Very interesting. As long as they are only models. But the problem is that there are some crazy politicians and they start to realize it, and if you don't fit to this model, you are eliminated. And this is a practical danger. So I don't want to eliminate, but metaphysics, I want to save metaphysics because ontology wants to overcome it. So I want to save metaphysics because it is the only philosophical discipline which, as by intention, wants to know reality. The second question is Heidegger and Sartre. The point is that the conception of man is so disintegrated and close to the divine, to God. Both are atheists as philosophers. Both are atheists. So if you enter this jungle, I don't know who will save you. And the third, metaphysics as science. This is what I try to explain. There are different conceptions of science. And the so-called positivistic or neo-positivistic conception of science, it is simply reductionism. And we have to be aware of it and how it happened. But I cannot agree that in the case of St. Thomas Aquinas, we have religious metaphysics. No. St. Thomas Aquinas is fully aware that philosophy must be autonomous, must be equally autonomous to save. Look, it's Ancilla Theologia. It's incredibly paradoxical. Look, philosophy as Ancilla Theologia, as a servant of theology, like geometry or arithmetics, you have to count. To be able to count apostles, you need to know mathematics, which is independent from theology. And the same, theology needs realistic, independent philosophy to understand the content of revelation. And this is the point.
Okay, Professor. May I remind the participants that I simply suggested that we add another rule, not forget about the previous rules. Please, limit your questions into one question. Yes?
The question is actually coming from curiosity. What is the role of imagination in the metaphysics that we are supposed to have? By imagination, I mean the literary works, including the various literatures, theology, philosophy, including Aristotle and Plato, which, in the words of Paul Ricoeur, the works that provide us ethical variations, creating for us possibilities for a more moral existence. This question is actually coming from the fact that I understand that it would be easier for us to determine whether the food is, whether it's real food or not real food. But when it comes to human emotions, human affections, these particular things we could are particular things that we could only approximate and not to have and would never be able to come up with adequate equivalents. Thank you.
Yeah. In the case of human cognition, realistic cognition, imagination is very important because it is from imagination that the intellect makes abstraction. And this is why when we watch TV, we do not use imagination. And the effect is that new generations are less and less intelligent. Really. But, because, okay, the second point, more serious from the viewpoint of the history of philosophy. You see, the cult of imagination has its Neoplatonic roots, and strictly speaking, Arabic roots. And it was, I have to check, it was either Ibn Arabi or Al-Farabi, but rather Ibn Arabi. You see, he replaced the Plotinus one by creative imagination. And it was very, very influential, especially during the time of Romanticism. And if you read all this Shelley and so on, they appeal to imagination. But what is the metaphysical diagnosis? It is kind of pantheism or panentheism, because the imagination, of course, of some poets who have better visions is a part of the divine imagination, you see? So the way of imagination, we have to be very, let's say, strict about imagination and very cautious, because images always are very moving. They are moving, you know, you have some different visions, but be careful, we have to ask the question whether it is real. Whether it is real. And the second, I am not a god. So it is those 2 points we have to take into account and have distance to not to treat imagination as a power higher than intellect with no respect towards reality.
Yes, Urbaniana, Vatican. Although who spoke before me said there is no need to thank you, Peter, I just have to thank you. I was so afraid I would miss your lecture because I got caught up in something else. I'm happy though I caught part of it. And my question will be from the part I caught, definitely. And that is, what concrete reasons do you really have to believe that it was the Greeks who discovered this particular way of viewing reality that we would call metaphysics? Is it not really something open to all humanity? And we only need to have to search documents to find where they are, whether in China, in Sudan, or in Venezuela. And on the same line, knowing that words have their histories, and ideas also are not often represented properly by the words that express them, wouldn't it be better to try to reclaim what we think is the original meaning of the words, instead of trying to define them so narrowly that we exclude things that belong really to them, the way that science has been defined now to exclude even metaphysics? Peter, are you sure you're not defining metaphysics in such a strict way that you're excluding those part of it?
Thank you. If you find, or someone, I'm open, if you find a document where you can say, here they discovered theoria, I'm all for you. The point is, and that's why we talk about this Greek genius, no? They really discovered this kind of life, theoretical life, and then, what is important, they put limitation of this kind of cognition using methodology. What happens is, even here when I listen to so interesting papers, it is hard to keep one way. You see, you add poetry, metaphors, prophets, and everything is mixed. Maybe it is very good for reception, but the Greeks were people who said, okay, we want to go the road which has some rules. Rules important for cognition we call scientific. And it is not that they reject all other kinds of cognition. No, but they say if you want to have the cognition called science, you have to respect this kind of methodology. And it is something, yeah, I really read a lot of books related to, because look, Egypt, you have pyramids, you have geometry inside. But the point is that they were not interested in theoretical problems. Mathematics was subordinated to practical uses. That's why for 3,000 years there was no development. But when the Greeks started to be, let's say, fanatics of science, look how quickly different areas of science started to develop. And this is the point. And even in the West, it was not properly appreciated. Romans preferred politics and ethics. In Christianity, there was a really strange opposition towards Greek wisdom and philosophy and metaphysics. It is well known. Then you have Neoplatonism. They said, no, more important is magics. You have Renaissance up to these days. We need only what has some practical uses. So they reconstruct universities and eliminate humanities, especially philosophy. So really, there were only few people who respected theoria as theoria in those days and even nowadays. I don't know why human intellect is so cautious about the truth in itself. So this is what we should, and Greeks themselves, they said, what we discovered, it is to benefit all humanity, and especially it was a sophist, Isocrates. He said that what we discovered is for all humanity. It is the truth, you see? Thank you.
Last two questions, please. One local, one foreign. Yes.
If the point of metaphysics is to be able to determine if a fruit is a real fruit or not, or if water is clean enough for us to drink it, if that is truth as correspondence and that is metaphysics, I'd like to ask, do we just want to classify knowledge like the table of elements, something so clean and something so seamless? What are these rules good for if we do not want them to seek through ethics, through human life, through the dialogue that we are actually conducting today? If we are that rigid, or if our only aim is to classify everything so clearly and so seamlessly.
Do not follow our way of looking from the metaphysical point of view. Yeah?
It's more of if our only purpose is to determine whether or not this apple is a real fruit or not. If that is the only purpose, if we're only able to classify one thing to another, I'd like to ask, what is the purpose of us crafting that skeletal system of knowledge if we will not allow it to seek through ethics or through art or through religion?
No, it is the question of metaphysics which gives you the general vision of being as such, and in the case of Apple, it was as an example to make clear what it means, the true cognition, and why the truth is a basic so-called value for other values. Because if you call it the good and it is not a true apple, it is not valuable apple, you see. So this is the point. That's why we need to remember that if you do not respect the order of reality as existing, it is hard to talk about the truth, because it is only by name that you say it is the truth. And without the existential conception of being, if we call it this way, it is impossible to talk about the truth as truth. It can be interesting, it can be fascinating, everything. But the question is whether it is the truth, you see. And so we need this general intellectual vision of being as being, because at this point we can see that the order of beings, and find the place of us, the human beings, in the area of being as being, you see. So this is how rationally we can be open towards God. This is the point. And really, we need only one apple to be open for God. Because this apple does not have the reason for its existence, you see. And there's only one being which can give existence. Only one being. Because to pass from non-being to being, you need an infinite power. Because non-being doesn't exist, you see. So this is why all these ideologies who are atheistic, they hate metaphysics. They hate, because it is what makes you rationally open to God. They want to look, this English terminology, when they, they make fun of religion. How can you defend going to the court? They hurt my feelings. Feelings? Animals have feelings. How can you talk this language, which is the heritage of British empiricists nowadays? You are unable. You see what is the influence of the language which comes from philosophy.
Okay. Yes. Last question, Professor.
I loved your paper. Thank you very much. And I was really cheering on as you were seeking the boot into Heidegger. I always like to see somebody seeking the boot into Heidegger. Unfortunately, I then got a bit uneasy because you were analysing Heidegger as only talking about the concept of being. And I started to have some doubts, and the doubts were this. If I think I have a pain, do I have a pain or don't I? Even if you tell me, no, you're not in pain, we've done tests, I might still have, look, I still have a pain. So if I think I've got a pain, then it seems I have a pain. Applying that to Heidegger, he thinks he's talking about being, and my reading of Heidegger is he talks very much about being. So my disquiet is this: is he talking about being, or are we, when he talks about being, even as a concept of being, is he talking about being?
Okay. Interchangeably, being or concept of being. And the same happens to Heidegger. And how to check it? It's very simple. Because we have to look what he means by being. And what he means by being is a concept of being. Because he was educated and he wrote his thesis on Scotus and Thomas from Erfurt, but he was Scottish. So he was educated on metaphysics and understood as ontology, which has as its object the concept of being. Otherwise, the only way to say, no, it is not a concept of being, it is being, what makes being being? If there is no place for existence understood as an act of being, it is not being. But because sure, in Scotus and ontologists they say about existence, but existence is only the mode of essence. And it is not the act of essence. And it is the most crucial difference. That's why I analyzed Heidegger from this point of view. And I couldn't find in him any moment, because who could taught him in those years in the seminary the conception of being as the essentially different between Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. And this is the point. So he was using this word being, but understood by it the concept of being.
Thanks very much. I will have to close the forum now because we still have promises to keep. It's been a pleasure chairing and moderating this session. Thank you.